Alright, another video on this QE stuff, and so I'll read some of these comments. I guess I won't read them, I'll paraphrase some of them, and just deal with some of this. So, the bottom line is, I guess you could suppose, is you just look at it this way. Alright, the Federal Reserve has digits. It has, electronic things that say somebody's owed something, electronic IOUs, so you can just call all this stuff digits. And so it has its separate digits. And the banking system has its own set of digits, and those digits, those statements of what somebody is owed, like your checking account or something, can migrate from one bank to another bank, and it doesn't mean anything. You don't have to convert it into cash and then move it to another bank and then put it into the bank and all that kind of stuff. You just migrate the digits. So the economy is largely functioning just on the movement of whose name is on a piece of IOU digit. So you can just change the name, just erase one name, put somebody else's name on it, put another name over there, and you've done the transaction. So there's no need for cash as any part or element of the creation, well, the transfer of digits. But the creation of digits has to happen through cash. Cash is the way you make new electronic digits in the system. So you have to actually take some cash to a bank and make the digits, because the only way to unmake a digit is to extract cash. So when cash is extracted or cash is put into a bank, that's when digits are created or destroyed. And so what basically happens with the Federal Reserve's reserve digits is they create cash. They can only be extracted as cash. And once they're extracted as cash, now they can become a new digit in the Federal Reserve. So how this all started is there was a chart, that where two lines stay together forever, like loans and deposits. And then those two lines separated in 2008, and there became a gap between those two lines. And the gap is that the Federal Reserve created these new digits that were essentially deposits. They created deposit digits in the real world, in the banker's world, but there was no cash that went with them. Just the digits were created, and not the cash that should have been deposited. So they just pretended to deposit the cash and just said to the banks, because we're the federal government, we can say those kind of things to the banks, just make the digits, okay? I'm not going to give you the cash, but just make the digits, and when the time comes, I'll give you the cash. And so, essentially, this does the same thing as printing the cash. It does the same thing as just giving the cash to, say, a hospital to pay for medical services, or giving the cash to the banks to pay off Social Security checks, or to give the cash for someone at the bank. It's the same thing in general as the government just printing money to pay for something. And the reserve account is just the record of that activity, and it just hasn't been forced to actually print the cash yet, okay, because the banks are they don't need cash until there's a run on the bank. So until there's a recession or a downturn, there's no run on cash. So no one's looking to extract their deposits. So as long as deposits are increasing, especially when you're increasing digits and the stock market's going up, then everybody is quite comfortable to leave the digits where they are. But as soon as something happens to degrade the value of having a banker's digit, then people are going to want to extract real cash out of the bank, and then the banks are going to need the cash from the Federal Reserve. And so eventually that cash is going to go into circulation. And once it goes into circulation, the only way the federal government can get it out of circulation is it essentially has to issue a bond, have the person pay them real cash for the bond, and then destroy the cash. So we essentially have to borrow money and get no value out of it whatsoever. And that's really bad. But that's the only way to get that money back, is the government has to actually purchase it back by creating a new instrument in the economy, a new hunk of value, and getting people to give them cash for it. And so There's $1 trillion in the banking system now in actual cash moving around in the economy. And there's $3.5 trillion in cash sitting in the reserve accounts. And the only way to get that cash, that obligation out of there, what will happen, like I said, as soon as the banks have a liquidity problem, they're going to be allowed to have the cash, in actual cash. And you're going to have a flood of actual cash into the economy, 4 times the amount that's in the economy now will be flooded into the economy at exactly the time you don't want to flood the economy with extra cash. And so that's the irony of this, is that this just sets us up for an even harder crash, because exactly the wrong thing is going to happen because of what they've set up as an obligation. So it's essentially setting up the obligation that if we had a financial crisis, no one would suggest, rationally, that, like if there were some sort of run on the bank, no one would suggest that the government should just start printing cash and throwing it into the economy. They would suggest some other discipline to slow people down and get people to not ask for their deposits back, or to do something else to try to slow down the economy a little bit until things can balance out. But the last thing it would want to do is just create this illusion of free money. But anyway, that's just going to be inflationary, and inflationary in this negative sense. So that's probably the real subject, is how does inflation work in a world where there is no pressure on labor. Labor has no power to demand wages. The inflation of the 70s was all wage created. Wages were increasing, and that was creating inflation. Now inflation is in a completely deflation, but there's inflation in asset values. Wealth is inflating, and labor value is deflating and decreasing. So it's exactly the opposite kind of pull, and when that rubber band does its reflexive reaction, it's going to have a completely different kind of impact. But the bottom line is you're going to first have that kind of asset inflation, and then you're going to have a real hard reality check kind of situation where, yes, wages will be nothing, and all commodities are going to be highly inflated in their prices, and so no one's going to be able to pay their rent anymore and all that kind of stuff. And so no asset's going to return any value, because there's going to be no one to extract it from, no productivity gains from which you can extract value. And there'll be no consumption and no employment, and it all goes horribly, horribly wrong. But anyway, that's probably not the subject. So the point is, is that the real value of printing cash is to get you through a troubled period. And what it basically does is it frees digits to buy other commodities. So it inflates things that are deflated. So the idea in 2008 was that the stock market was highly deflated. They needed to inflate it back to its old prices, or they were going to be in big trouble. And so they inflated it by basically buying assets that were consuming digits. So if I take assets off the market, then people have to buy something else. So if I bought all the gold in the world with Martian money, then all the money that was in gold would have to buy something else, and it would inflate the prices of those things. And that's what the Fed has done with that $3.5 trillion in Federal Reserve digits. It's essentially bought stuff off the market without ever printing the money. It's just bought the stuff off the market and freed assets that were associated with those commodities. So now those digits can go buy something else. So it's essentially liberated cash into the economy in the sense of cash digits, without providing the real cash, because they were using the old digits. They're just liberating old digits, not creating new digits, essentially. But eventually the new digits will have to be created, because the Fed will have to print the money eventually and give it to the banks. Yeah, that's the answer. Anyway, you know, you have to be careful. You have to be careful in my argument. It looks like it's all going to go tits up. I vow to ring my mother's pleas for impending doom. Alright, so it's basically talking about coal mines, and so yeah. Throughout history, there's been the doom mongers, and so he's just arguing that maybe we're just doom mongering and everything's going to be just fine. Well, I think there are things that you can call writing on the wall. And when the government has set itself up, that as soon as the crisis starts, as soon as there's any kind of run on the bank, and banks are going to need liquidity, the response of the federal government as set up by these reserve accounts is print cash. They're going to flood the system with cash. And that seems like the prescription for doom. I mean, at least doom in the sense of inflation, here we come. Deflation of cash money as an asset. Cash money will lose value, and workers will have no ability to ask for more money for their labor. So if their cash has less value and their labor doesn't have any more value, that's going to mean inflation for average Joe, and that's going to mean no buying any G.I. Joe with the Kung Fu grip, to use a movie line. Anyway, Trading Places, I think, right? Anyway, so this comment, this is like an anti-bullshit man response. Well, anyway, he's talking about, you know, implying that I was hypocritical in my commentary to anti-bullshit man because I'm pleading for empathy for people, and then in the same sentence I'm complaining about people getting kicked off their property. Well, I thought I made it clear in the video. The people getting kicked off their property are not innocent poor people. Okay, they're the kind of poor people who, you know, they're allowed to drink beer on welfare, and they're allowed to have pets on welfare, and they're allowed to smoke cigarettes on welfare, and they're allowed not to pay their rent on welfare. Alright, they're getting a ton of money from society to take care of their bills, and they're squandering it and pissing it all away on movies and stuffed animals, and you just think of all the silliest, most frivolous things. So they've wasted all their money, haven't paid their rent, and expect everybody to be sympathetic. And then they borrow money and never pay anybody back. So they've sort of been doing that for decades, and then they just started doing it really badly for 2 years. And it's like, why should anybody have empathy for people where you've given them every resource, given them every opportunity to live like decent human beings, and they just fucked you in the ass? Why should society give a fuck about people who you gave them every crutch, every wheelchair, every ability, and then they wanted more? You know, fuck them. There's a point where you can't have empathy for people because they have a psychology where they have absolutely no humility, no respect, no gratitude, no gratefulness, no anything that makes them possible to be civilized. They just can't live with other people because they're pariahs and leeches, and they're a plague and a blight. And society should just say, fuck you. Here's a rowboat. Have a nice trip. Get out of town. Get out of here, you fuckers. You know, go eat fish. Whatever. You know, it's whatever. So Mary, I didn't say anything. She gave the link to the frequently asked questions, which is a nice little page from the Fed, but it is just complete jabberwocky. You know, it's a complete convoluted mishmash conversation. But it does just point out that we've bought, you know, over $2 trillion worth of our own government bonds with these fake digits, and $1 trillion something worth of junk bonds with these fake digits, and that you know, basically all we've done is buy them out of ownership. We never paid for them, but we bought them out of ownership. So they're still sitting there, and someday they're going to have digits tied to them. Their digits that they represent the use of is going to have to show up. And when that happens, it's not going to be pretty. And again, remember, once we get that $4 trillion into the economy, the extra 4 that it will be when they're done, you have to buy it out of the economy. So to get back to a rational amount of cash in the economy, to get cash back to being valuable again, the government will have to borrow more money and burn it. Yeah. Yeah, like that's going to work, right? Like that's going to happen, right? They're not going to do that. They're not going to burn it. They're just going to print more digits. They're just going to we're heading right for the let's just print the cash scenario, and that can't do anything but create. If I make twice as much gold in the world tomorrow, you got to know that the price of gold is going to drop, right? You know, if all of a sudden I show up with $1 zillion worth of gold, you know the price of gold's got to go down. And when the cash goes into the economy, the price of cash is going to go down. The value of cash is going to crash. So anyway, here's the other video where Mariana left a comment. Okay, I agree, low interest rates forever. Well, see, the forever thing is a trick, right? Because it won't be low interest rates forever, right? What will be is low interest rates till the crash. So the forever is going to be till the crash. And then once everything crashes, then you go back to rational interest rates again. But yes, it's low interest rates till the crash. The excessive reserves are still reserves. Well, again, they're not in anybody's rational sense of the thing what reserves are supposed to be. So there's no point in calling it a reserve. Okay, they're not there to protect against some sort of run on the bank or do any of that stuff. They're not there for protection. They're there hiding the cash from the economy. That's what they're there. They're just there to be, they're hidden. Okay, but that's all. They're just hiding them there so they don't have to have actual cash, you know, in the economy. But eventually they're going to get cashed out. Somebody's going to want their money. The reserves cannot be withdrawn. Well, yes they can. So I think that's just absolutely bullshit. As soon as the bank says, I need the liquidity that you have denied me, they're going to be given the cash. As soon as they say somebody wants cash and I don't have it because you never paid me for these bonds, then they're going to be entitled to it. There's going to be no way the government can say, no, you can't have the cash we owe you for buying bonds. It doesn't make any sense, does it? You really can't tell somebody to go buy something and then never pay for it. Well, you can't get away with that. These excess reserves are the reserve requirement for bonds and mortgage-backed securities. Well, that's bullshit. They're not the reserve requirement for those things. The reserve requirement would be 10% of the value, not the entire value. Okay? I mean, we've bought, say, $4 billion worth of crap, and there is $3.5 trillion worth of reserves. Now, how do you defend that as being a reserve requirement? That would be 90% reserve requirement. There's no 90% reserve requirement, so that's just nonsense. If these were reserves held to cover the deposits, you'd be talking about $500 billion, not 3.5 trillion. Which is part of QE. It doesn't get confusing when the word excess is thrown in. Well, I'm just sorry. The word excess isn't used just by the media. It's used by the Federal Reserve itself. It's used by everybody. And it's just the fact that the reserve requirements are in the billions of dollars. And that the reserves held in these accounts are in the trillions of dollars. And obviously there's a there's a distinction there. And this cash can be taken as soon as banks lack liquidity, cash liquidity, not digit liquidity. But as soon as the depositors start withdrawing real cash, all right, all that reserve money goes into the economy. But really, they are still required reserve. No, they're not. So I still say that's just absolute crap. The banks can take the money, and obviously they've been told not to take the money, though, until they claim a liquidity crisis. Quantitative easing has its own rules. It's not even quantitative easing. It's a whole different kind of animal, because they didn't legitimately buy this crap. In the past, they legitimately bought it, and now they're not legitimately buying it. So that's kind of just bullshit. They're just playing the game they can get away with when the economy is fake growing. So when you're growing asset values and not growing real value, when the stock market is inflating, you can get away with this and say, I don't have to pay for it today. But as soon as the stock market is deflating, and as soon as there's a little bit of a run on cash, all that cash is going into the economy. Yeah. Alright, so I think it's enough. Thank you very much and such.